Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Surplus of Suffering, where we accept that life is suffering, but our minds are powerful. And we can use our powerful minds to reduce the instances of suffering where it's in surplus, instances that don't need to exist. And while we aren't experts, we are deep thinkers and students. My name is Brett. My degree is in statistics, and my brain thinks in statistics, and that's a strength and a weakness sometimes. I'm also on the spectrum and a cancer survivor, so my insights into suffering are unique and interesting. It's not holistic, it's not comprehensive, but after all of my experiences, I found a need to communicate some of these things on the internet. Even though we're not the only ones saying it, I think the messenger matters sometimes, and I'm hoping to connect with anybody, make a difference with anybody. And so me and my friend here decided this podcast is important.
Oh yeah, my name is Sol. I have a degree in math, degree in psychology, minor in philosophy, and like you said, we love to think deeply and discuss these topics. I have a coaching certification as well. I've worked with child psychiatrists, and my mission here is to help people learn more about themselves, and that way they can master themselves, master their emotions, and be able to enjoy and live happy and fulfilling lives. And that's why we're here to talk about all of these different things that lead to unnecessary suffering, like Brett mentioned. And today's topic is going to be a tough one for for a lot of people to hear because it has a lot to do with some of the worst things that humanity is capable of doing, and there's a lot of suffering there, and that's why we felt it was necessary to talk about this topic today.
Yeah, it's you can't make a podcast about suffering and not talk about some of the things humanity is responsible for. So this is episode 4, and we're actually here to talk about masculinity and femininity in the modern world and what that looks like. And so it's a touchy topic, one that we don't approach lightly. We have to make some disclaimers. We're not we're not trying to divide men and women. You know, there are differences in whether it's the hormones or the chromosomes or the brain chemistries. It's just pointing out the differences isn't what we're trying to do. In fact, we're trying to do the opposite, really. It is emphasize that we're all on the same team. We're a blend of these traits, and masculinity and femininity being a moving target. If you want to define it, you have to specifically talk about what era of time are we in, what culture, what part of the world are we in, because not too long ago George Washington was putting on powder on his face, and that was like a manly thing to do, is wear the wigs, right? And when I say manly, it was just expected, it was professional, and so the norms of the time matter. And we want to focus on modern times because what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine, and have all those elements. It's just talking about history is going to be an important part to try to reflect on some of these things. As I said, we think deeply about history and we value it.
Right. And yeah, the main point that we want to hit here is, understanding that masculinity and femininity are socially constructed sets of traits, right? And they are attached to cultures and different times. So they're not as set in stone as we tend to think of them. And they have this huge impact on how we think about ourselves, how we behave in the world, and like Brett said, what is normal? What is the expected role?
Yeah, there are ripple effects from that. Yeah, what the expectations and the things that are expected, the things that are respected, just in our country alone. You go to some parts of Georgia, there's certain expectations and things that are respected in your environment. And then, but if you take yourself to certain parts of California, you'd be really surprised about what is expected or respected of men. And there are some positives and negatives of both environments, I think. And that's why I tried to say same team, because I think those two environments I just described might look at the other one and say, and just see the negative. And I think that part's covered on the internet.
Mhm.
you know, uh, I'd like to see if we can connect those different cultures, even within our own country, as diverse as the United States is. Um, but I think we're going to jump right into it and maybe talk about a historical reference of a surplus of suffering, and it's connected to masculinity and femininity, because something I feel like one of the horrible things we have to talk about is probably sexual assault, and trigger warning is probably appropriate here, because we're going to talk about some pretty delicate things, and try not to get into specifics, but anybody who is sensitive to this topic, please be aware. But I wanted to talk about sexual assault in the context of war, because as far as history is concerned, there's a lot of instances, whether we're talking about Vikings or the Huns, and that's basic stuff as far as just dominating and burning villages and destruction. But I wanted to specifically hone in on the end of World War II, because it wasn't that long ago. We had civilization. It was recent enough to where we should acknowledge this part of history, that this happened, because a lot of people, everyone knows about the suffering related to the concentration camps, that we've even mentioned some of that. But at the end of World War II, when things were coming to an end, Germany was getting collapsed on at all sides. We had the US coming, we had the UK moving in from the north, we had France retaking their land and moving into Germany, and we had the Russians, the Soviet army, moving in all at the same time at the end. And I bring it up because these are the Allied forces, the good guys, the ones that, history is written by the victors. The Allied forces were the ones we liberated, right? Each army came, the Soviet had revenge on their minds. The Soviets did, because, Russia got invaded. And so did France, because they were occupied for 3 whole years. America saw some POW camps where they saw some of their fellow soldiers and how they were treated. And so every single army, as they moved in, they were weaponizing sexual assault as a weapon of war, just like historically speaking, because they saw the suffering that was done to them. But the thing is, the revenge doesn't work out the way, because the revenge came at the cost of all of the women, the German women, who specifically didn't exactly have. That's not getting back at the military. It's about 1 million cases of sexual assault happened between the spring of 1945 and the end of 1946. That's all technically the war was over, but it came at the suffering of many women. It was said that 2 out of 5 children in Bavaria were actually Soviets. Like, there were such a proportion of children where the women were shamed and disgraced. The children of these sexual assaults were shamed and disgraced. They didn't really belong anywhere. It was the ripple effects from the good guys, per se, because relative to all the suffering that was caused by Germany, this stuff was kind of swept under the rug. And honestly, all the victims of sexual assault did not get justice. It wasn't categorized as a war victim or war crime. So, because recognizing all of the sexual assaults as a war crime would put them on the same level as the other punishments. So, none of them were considered war crimes. And so, you skip that part in the history books because there's such an abundance of suffering. But I just wanted to talk about the women, and then the next generation, the children, who didn't know if they were German or Russian, German or American, and they didn't really belong anywhere. And it just breaks down structure and community.
Yeah, and that's one specific example in history, but this is something that not just happens in mass like that in single instances, but is happening all the time, all over the world. There is not just sexual assaults on women, but just violence in general as well. And these things are not by any means okay, but we're going to be talking about, where these things derive from, and why is it the case that men have these such violent tendencies, and why is it that sexual assaults are so prevalent, and that the statistics, hopefully, Brett maybe has something specific to talk about that, but the amount of women that report having experienced some kind of sexual assault is insanely high, and that's knowing that this is something that is underreported.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was my obvious contribution as the stats guy. Is like, well, the quality it's underreported. Like a lot of data is hard to collect accurately. When I gave the estimate about number of sexual assaults in that time period, it's pretty hard. A lot of it's documented because of the babies being born is documented, but it's there's shame associated with whenever there's that kind of suffering, and that shame that the women carry, um, that's a surplus of suffering that shouldn't exist, especially when they keep it a secret, or maybe there's abortions related to some of this. And so these ripple effects are the surpluses. So I think the best case to try to stop that is the prevention of the assaults happening in the first place, and that's not so easy, but it's a noble thing to talk about, raise awareness about. And the stats you were referring to, I do have something to talk about, which is a UN global report of homicides. And specifically, this report is, we'll put the link in the bio, it's on femicide in 2024. So it's a global report talking about breaking down homicides by female and male and showing a couple interesting insights, I think, because this is also a tough one to report too, because homicides globally are hard to estimate. Africa's involved in this report, and so take it with a grain of salt. But I think the tendencies and the trends that they identify are worthy to look at. So I think I'm going to provide an image for the viewers, but I'm looking at a breakdown of all homicides. 80% of the homicides documented globally by the UN were male. 20% were female victims. So, 1 in 5 of the homicide victims were female. But when you go a layer deeper, into it, when it comes to how many people, what proportion of victims were killed by an intimate partner, past or present, or a family member, 60% of the female homicide victims were by an intimate partner, past or present, or a family member, compared to only 11% of the male population of victims. That disproportion, I mean, to think that most of the female victims, more than half, are done by people that they were very close to or related to, is kind of terrifying. Like, as a man, I wasn't as always heads up about that, but I can totally see why a woman would have fear and anxiety around staying safe, especially just given the numbers. Not that everyone's getting murdered, but if I was to get murdered and I was a woman, it'd be more likely to be someone I had been close to. And that's terrifying. And honestly, I brought up those numbers to say, even though women were only 1 in 5 of the victims, the number of people, when you look at all the ones murdered by intimate family members or partners, the total number of victims is still more women than men, even though they only account for 1 in 5 of the total. And that's a disproportion that is hard to ignore. So even if the numbers aren't perfectly correct, I think there's a message there.
Yeah. Yeah, I was doing research to prepare for this conversation, and I saw this interesting idea that I hadn't really heard about before, which was that there's cultures that get classified as, well, this is a predominantly more masculine leaning culture, and this is a predominantly more feminine driven culture. And they had, their definitions of what that meant. Um, and the ones that are categorized as being more masculinely oriented uh, tended to have that higher rates of violence and discrimination against women. So I think it's that tie between the ideas that are prevalent and what gets normalized in certain societies, and it is this violence and seeing women not as equals that makes this prevalence of violence being so normalized, because it's been happening and it keeps happening.
Yeah, I think, yeah, not seeing, like you're saying, it's almost like when women aren't treated as equals. It's interesting because, to me, because you can measure height in inches. For instance, like the average man is taller than the average woman, or you can measure strength, and there's a lot of confounding variables as soon as you start. I'm not trying to divide men and women. I'm just trying to say there are some phenotypical features that make a lot of men feel like they're better or stronger, but there's a lot of invisible traits and qualities. Like, think about empathy, think about love, think about all these other things that we all have a capability for. Maybe some have more than others, and that's something that doesn't appear in the size of your bicep or the height on the ruler. Um, and I just wanted to bring up another thing about, I was talking about homicide victims. Like, the stats speak for themselves, but at the same time, there's so many people worried about becoming a statistic that they're they're suffering in silence. They might be afraid, they might be depending on someone they wish they didn't have to. um, and that's where we're talking about women still, but I think if you don't talk about the people just living in fear, like, that's a form of surplus of suffering too. So anyone living in fear in a close relationship or in any living situation, like, trying to prevent those situations from happening in the first place is important.
Yeah. And I don't think we'll be able to really prevent any of it
Yeah.
until we can change how we define, or not necessarily how we define these roles, but how we relate to these expectations of ourselves as men, and
Yeah.
expectations of what it means to be a man in the modern world. And we're bombarded with different philosophies, and from the past, from the present, and at the end, every man has to decide for himself, what does it mean to be a good man. But a lot of people are just raised being taught, well, it means that you are in charge of the household and you have to provide, and you're not going to be doing any of the nurturing because that's a woman's job. And a lot of boys are discouraged from expressing emotions, from playing with dolls, from doing things that are typically associated with feminine qualities. But what this does is that it creates an imbalance in the household that they will be a part of later, and within themselves, because they don't feel comfortable expressing the natural femininity that is within us, because we are created by both feminine and masculine, and we carry both feminine and masculine traits. And it's not until we are allowed to express both masculinity and femininity without, for men, our masculinity being put into question, and for women, their femininity to being put into question. Until we can get rid of those roles and expectations that kind of put us into a box of what we're supposed to do, what we're allowed to do. We're not going to be able to get away from the impacts of those ideas on our behavior.
Yeah, and like, there might be patterns that, well, maybe there's more adherence to, not so much adherence to these feminine practices as a kid, or maybe it's, the trends might be there, but the expectations that you touched on, how strong are these expectations? It's like, what are we allowed to and not allowed to do? All of a sudden, like, not, if you don't allow everyone to express that feminine side of them, they don't find it themselves. And a lot of times they do end up finding themselves, but maybe there's trauma in the way because of the expectations that are being put there. And so I think that's why we wanted to talk about unhealthy masculinity, and instead of calling it toxic, because I think unhealthy masculinity is what we're really trying to talk about, because this is the stuff we can discourage. Instead of attacking men, we're just talking about what that can look like. And a lot of it, from my perspective, and this is just from my experience and as a young person, and also seeing people around me, is usually stems from holding back emotions on some variety,
Mm-hmm.
repressing emotions. When people are raised with the insistence that, if you cry, you're a sissy, if you're afraid, you're a wussy, these kinds of things, or if you stop to show empathy, it's like a weakness. And and it leaves vulnerability like undeveloped. People hide their fears, they repress their emotions, and empathy is left unpracticed. Those are just a few examples of some of the ways masculinity can lead to detriment, can lead to holes in regulating emotions, and the expectations, you know uh, keep on reinforcing themselves at that point.
That's right. Oh, I had another example um about that, and it escaped me. You got any other examples?
Well, I'm thinking about culture, accounting for culture, because some cultures are very aware of what we're talking about, right? And there needs to be a healthy awareness of it, but also it doesn't mean you need to counteract it. If you're surrounded by the culture, you need to counteract it so bad you might be robbing. Giving a child, every child and every person should have a chance to express themselves. I have more examples because I'm thinking of fashion. I wore this shirt for a reason because I was so afraid to wear any colors growing up. I was afraid to look a certain way. I my identity with clothes was so strange. I would yell at my mom like, I don't want anything on my t-shirt. It needs to be plain. And then she'd bring me a plain t-shirt and I'd find a reason to be not okay with it. And people who knew me in high school will know I wore like 5 shirts. And why did I wear that one shirt with the hole in it? It's like I was comfortable in it. And then it took years to find out, hey, I actually like colors. I like patterns. This shirt, I like it. I have a lot of Hawaiian shirts. People who know me now see me as the guy with the Hawaiian shirt. And honestly, I like that because when people see the guy in the fun shirt, they're not thinking he's a downer or he's mean. They're more likely to accept me and be willing to hear me out and get to know me because that's what I really want. I'm a nice guy. So that's just fashion being one of them. Hairstyle. I was so afraid of styling my hair in such a way. I just grew it out and kind of shamefully had a long haircut when in reality I was kind of a good looking guy. And if I just embraced my hair and I felt feminine to express my hairstyle. Singing is another one. I love to sing. I never did it. I was too afraid of sounding a certain, even though I was in band and I was a high achiever. Okay, it's manly to play the tuba. Why? Because it has low pitch. Like that's so silly. But I found out my love for singing is deep, and throughout history, people have sung, people sang, and people danced. Another one that until college, I was too afraid to move my feet like that. I thought, for some reason, there was a prevailing belief around me that dancing wasn't necessary or men don't do that or
Right.
those are all surpluses of suffering in the sense that I never got a chance to express myself. Maybe I would have been a great dancer. I'll use that as an excuse because unfortunately now, not a great one. But
It's not too late.
yeah, it's not too late. Never too late. That's a good point.
Yeah, I'll give you a salsa lesson next time I see you.
Yeah, I'm down.
Um, but thank you for those examples, and those are great because yeah, that emotional suppression and just suppression of yourself, of how you want to express. Like you're scared of being outed by the group as like, what? You're not part of the group. You're not a
Yeah,
masculine guy, and we're trying to be masculine guys, so we're not gonna associate with you. And like, no one wants that rejection from the friends, right? From the group, because we're social creatures. And now I remembered the point that I wanted to bring up earlier is the whole idea that men have to be independent, and they shouldn't need to rely on others, right? I can figure it out on my own, right? I don't need help. And that is one of the main reasons that men tend to not ask for help when they need it. And it is so important for any man out there to know that it is okay to ask for help. And I say that from experience because there was a time where not even realizing I was falling for that trap where I
yeah,
was spiraling down. We talked about this in episode 2, and I was going down a negative spiral, and I didn't really talk about it with people close to me. In my mind, I was saying I don't want to burden them with what's going on with me. I will figure this out. I can handle this. But it would have been so much easier for me to get out of that negative spiral if I had the support of the people around me, of the people that love me, to help me turn my mind around and help me realize that I was going down this negative spiral.
yeah. That's so important to bring up. Asking for help and not feel the burden specifically. I think there's a lot of men who hear what you're saying, a lot of people who don't want to feel like a burden. But it's weird when I look back on times when I had a lot of close friends, or I considered them close, and one of them might be going through a really tough time and is going through a lot of effort to hide it from their friends. And they don't want to be a burden. And maybe the friends aren't equipped, but they're kind of putting they're projecting, they're already expecting what their friends are able and not able and to do. Or what if I do that, if I tell them or be vulnerable with these guys, they're not going to like me as much anymore, or I'm just going to be a downer, or they're not going to be able to help me. And that feeling of I can figure it out myself is it's like banging your head against the wall. Sometimes you do. Great. What about the times you don't? If you don't figure it out yourself, surplus of suffering, ding, ding, ding. Like I had a friend lose a family member, and and they were making some. There was a lot of effort involved of trying to figure out the estate and the house, and I was around actually in the area, and I could have helped out in a way of just taking some load off of their back in a tough time, and they didn't reach out, and that's just his nature, my friend's nature, to not ask for help. And as a friend, I think a lot of people might have been in this position before. As a friend, it almost makes you disappointed. Like, why didn't you reach out?
Hmm.
Like, I would have been so happy to help. And then they're thinking, no, the suffering, the embarrassment of reaching out for help is sometimes off, like, is so much that they're like, even if it does benefit me a little bit, it's not worth it. And when it stops being worth it, I think that's an alarm because it's usually worth it. I was only willing to confide in a lot of my friends that were girls. My wife was one of my close friends, and she was somebody I felt like I could confide these emotions in, someone who understood them. But it doesn't mean other men around me weren't able to. It's just in my head, I was willing to say, oh, she'll understand. So it's really the belief. Will they understand? Well, if you have a friend who actually you care about a lot and you know they care about you, then it's worth the leap of faith that they might understand or care.
Right. And this is a great example of what, healthy masculinity would show up
Yeah.
as, of you being able to show up and say, hey, I'm not feeling great. Here's what's going on. Like, that should be okay. And you shouldn't be made to feel bad about yourself for doing it. That's another thing that I know that people fall uh, victims to, which is they try to be vulnerable with someone, and then because of those ideas and social expectations, people get taken aback and they're like, I don't even know how to react to this. Why are you being emotional? Are you complaining?
Mm.
Or what? Like, what is this? Like, it's almost like I've heard that men are only allowed to have one emotion. It's anger, and unfortunately, that anger is going to lead to not so good things for that person, whether it's going to be violence against themselves. And at some point, I did want to bring up the high suicide rate for men, and it is because of these ideas that perpetuate themselves that men have all these suffering, and it comes out either in violence against themselves or violence against the people around them.
Yeah, violence. It's like it can come. So many things can manifest as that, and it might just seem like one, like you said, one emotion, but there's so many emotions behind in the background that just come out as violence or anger or aggression, and
Yeah.
that's. I wanted to talk about resolving conflict. You just reminded me because there's a lot of ways to do it, and I think there's you can it's not necessarily masculine or feminine to resolve conflict, because I was thinking of ways that it can get resolved, and it's like sometimes it's done through aggression and violence and authority, like, and everybody shut up, and maybe there's some violence associated, and that is one way to resolve a conflict. It's not the best way, I don't think, because
It's a
you can also,
stereotypically masculine way to do it.
yeah, I would say stereotypically masculine, but then it's like you can also resolve it through love and empathy, grace, forgiveness.
Stereotypically feminine.
Stereotypically limited, but it's like I think every man should be capable of love and empathy and grace, and that's tough to ask for some people more than others. And maybe every woman should have a spot in their brain for, aggression, if they need to stand up for themselves, speak up,
That's right. That's
because
right.
I encourage women to speak up. As someone who's on the spectrum, sometimes, not just women. Here we go. If you take this out of context, I'm in trouble. But I'm really just talking about people who might have an opinion, or maybe they're not comfortable sharing it. They'd rather smile and say something just to smooth things over, path of least resistance, which I understand. But at the same time, sometimes I'll hear someone say something to my face, and then the next week I hear they feel the opposite, or they disagreed with me, and I think I'm capable of having healthy disagreements, but sometimes, their past experiences, the expectations they have of if they speak up and
Right.
disagree, what's going to happen to them, which actually leads me to, I want to talk about brotherhood and sisterhood, unless you had something else to say. Um,
I did, but I forgot. I'll say it later.
oh, okay. Well, I was just going to talk about brotherhood and sisterhood because there is something about that, and not to leave out anyone who's in between, especially, I'm going on a tangent, but intersex people exist, and transgender people exist, and they deserve their identity respected. So as much as we're saying men and women, I'm not forgetting those people, because a lot of those people are are involved in SOSs. So, but as far as brotherhood and sisterhood is concerned, it doesn't have to be. The reason why I want to bring it up is because we were talking about those set of expectations and those standards. So if you're in the same time and place and culture as a lot of other men as a man, that means all those other men generally have a lot of the same expectations put upon them in the same culture and time as you. So it allows you to relate on a special kind of level, not just on a biological level, but like this, we're trying to be men in this environment at this time. In the same way, a group of women, a prenatal yoga class, for instance, they're women in a culture, in a time period where there are certain expectations of what being a woman is supposed to be and what it's going to be, and so they have a special bond in their own way, and respecting the special bond while also not dividing us. We're all on the same team, but it doesn't mean the special bonds between men can't exist and special bonds between women can't exist, um, as a healthy way to channel the energies of the fluidity of our masculinity and femininity. Just because I go hang out with the guys and act a certain way doesn't mean I'm being fake with my wife when I'm with her and we're spending quality time together. And it's not the same kind of quality time as when I'm with the boys and watching the game or whatever it is, just to use a stereotype.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's very important to bring up. And I feel like anyone that's out there feeling isolated, it's important to go out and talk to people in the community about what's going on, because a lot of people are struggling through those same things, and that's why there's a lot of men groups out there that a lot of guys benefit from getting that support from other guys that are going through the same thing. And I'm sure there's the same thing for women that are going through tough things in in the current in the current era.
Yeah. And I know we focused a lot on men, as men, we're sitting here talking about masculinity and also femininity, but we're not women. It doesn't mean we don't have feminine sides. It doesn't mean we don't have an opinion, or we're not allowed to have an opinion on femininity. And I don't want to single out femininity, but I do want to talk about empathy in particular, if you don't mind. Empathy, an interesting topic for me as someone who had to kind of practice and develop it. It didn't come as naturally to me. I'm not afraid to admit, because I've seen the people where it's so built into their DNA where it's undeniable. Like, and that's kind of what I want to talk about was the extreme empathy that can exist. And let's just say, versus height. You were talking about height is measured, right? Let's just say you could measure empathy in somebody and there's a baseline, and obviously it's influenced by how you're raised. But let's say you crank the empathy meter up to 100 on a person. It actually can become a disability of sorts, extreme empathy. And I'm not trying to villainize it, don't get me wrong. It's just, if empathy is taking up 100% of your brain, you don't have any room for yourself or others. Um, I just want to say a few things about that. Like, extreme empathy, it can cause emotional burnout. It can cause empathy fatigue, and it can sometimes impair decision making. It can lead to emotional decisions that, when you lose sight of the bigger picture. And through research, it's pretty clear, as long as it's healthy to practice empathy even on an extreme level, as long as you set boundaries. Your
Mm-hmm.
empathy with boundaries protects yourself. If there's not self-care, if you're so empathetic you're willing to sacrifice all of your own needs, for somebody else who maybe doesn't appreciate them that much, as long as you don't take other people's emotions as your own literally, then it should protect the surplus of suffering that sometimes come with the extreme empathy I was talking about. And someone might know, you might know some people like that, or been around some people like that. I wouldn't say my wife's the 100%. I don't think anybody exists 100%, like I was saying, just as an example though. But I'm appreciative of the most empathetic people in my life. Uh, and that's another message to people. Like, if you know these empathetic people, appreciating and protecting them is also partly, I would debate, partly our responsibility as people who benefit from empathy. As a victim of brain cancer, and I saw so many people willing to do so much without expecting anything in return. Like, that's critical for humanity. Like, imagine if empathy was turned down to zero. What humanity? I
Mm-hmm.
don't. My opinion is that we wouldn't have made it this long as humans.
Oh no. I I love that you brought this up because it's about balance. At the end of the day, right? Too much empathy, um, you're not setting boundaries, right? This is often something that is attributed to, I would say, like feminine norms that kind of create suffering, like you said, like not speaking up, right? Being more passive, or you know, the idea is that women are meant to be the nurturers, right? So overly nurturing everyone else and not nurturing yourself, and like you said, that leads to burnout. This idea that like you have to just self-sacrifice, and that's your role. It's in a if when done in an unbalanced way, it hurts not just you but everyone around you. And me being someone that has always kind of been in touch with the more feminine aspects of myself and being empathetic, and these things, I can relate to that suffering and having to learn to set those boundaries. And at the same time, growing up, having to deal with the fact that I was a man, or a boy growing up to be a man who was in touch with his emotions, and realizing, oh, this isn't the norm. Like,
Yeah.
people look at me weird. Oh, I have friends that are girls and I'm not interested in them sexually, and everyone around me was like, "What, is this guy gay? Like, what's going on here?" I didn't fit into the mold, and I had to learn early on, like, all right, like people are gonna think stuff, people are gonna say things, and I was lucky enough to be very secure within myself to be like, I don't care if people think I'm gay. I'm going to express my feelings if I have them. But at the same time, being very empathetic and not wanting to, be a burden for others, I also developed like those kind of the more negative aspect of that, of not setting
Yeah.
those boundaries for myself.
Yeah, you're so empathetic, you don't want to bother anybody else. It's like you're the one suffering. I actually have a story. Like you said, stereotypically, maybe we think of women when we think about that extreme empathy, and maybe if you're looking at the top 5 percentile, maybe it is mostly women. And I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to think of people. I'm trying to think of people because I saw a social media post about a woman who saw a man and a woman fighting, and they were getting physical, and she was looking out for the woman, and she yelled out, like, pretended like she was her friend, like, "Oh, hey bestie, like, come on," and like kind of saved her from the conflict that she was having with the man. uh and so she was doing a noble thing there, but she invited the girl up to her apartment, and turns out the girl was on some drugs, and all of a sudden she had a stranger in her apartment who was like wrecking the place, and stole a
Oops.
couple things, and found herself in a position where, oh, I don't want this person in my house, and she was getting scared herself, and she had to like call someone to come remove the person, and she was like
Mm,
telling the story, like kind of ashamed of herself, but at the same time she was like, I would do that every single time. It's just maybe I'll stay in the lobby next time. Maybe instead of bringing them up
yeah.
to my actual apartment, I'll take them away and then keep them. And that's a great example of like her reflecting, like, maybe I'll set the boundary of, maybe don't bring the stranger into my home, even though, she's doing the right thing. You know what? I'm proud of her for doing the right thing, and actually reflecting back and saying, how could I have done it differently, but still and been the empathetic person, and proud of not leaving that woman in danger. Um,
Right.
so that's why I thought that post was really interesting.
Yeah, that's a great example too of extracting wisdom from a mistake or from
Yeah.
a traumatic experience. And that's something that oftentimes I feel like sometimes we take away the wrong lesson, right? And we generalize. And I say this because while doing all this research, I can see why it's so easy for, women that have experienced violence, experience this physical trauma or sexual violence. And
Yeah.
and then, like, in dealing with that, they and other people hearing about these things, and in their minds going, oh well, it's the men that are the problem, and villainizing men in general,
Yeah.
versus what the lesson that we're trying to extract here is to say that it's the ideas about these expectations of men and of women and of masculinity and femininity that is the cause of these behaviors. And it's not men or women that are the problem, but it's these ideas and expectations that we all collectively hold. And we should stop trying to blame someone else and say that's the problem, but to acknowledge that we can all be part of the solution, because the
Yeah.
solution is to unite, to be able to find love, right? If anyone out there has the desire to start a family or be in a relationship, you don't necessarily have to have children, but you're going to have to find that balance of masculinity and femininity, not only outside of yourself but within yourself as well, because if you can't express all parts of yourself, then you won't be able to be with someone that is also doing the same thing. You're going to be hiding certain parts of you, and there's going to be imbalance in those relationships as well. So we must find balance in ourselves, with our masculine and our feminine traits, and find peace in being able to express those things, and to finally be able to feel safe, because that's part of why there's so much fear for men and for women to speak up about these things, because of the reaction that society has when you don't fit the stereotype, when you don't fit the norm. And those things just perpetuate and cause more traumatic experience, like above the first
Hmm.
experience. It just makes it worse and worse, and it's what isolates us and leads to all this surplus of suffering.
Yeah. Isolation, an easy identifier, and I think that's a human thing. And it's a lot easier, I think, from my perspective. I see a lot more men in our culture and time fall into that isolation or addiction, right, and suicide. But I'm glad you brought up villainizing one or the other, because yeah, it's easy to say we're all on the same team, we can all help each other. It's just sometimes talking about men and women again. I hate to do it, I hate to generalize, but I am, because sometimes there's women that they know, they have good information, they have good knowledge and wisdom as to how gaps in how a man is behaving, or places where they can improve, or feminine wisdom essentially.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean they're the messenger. Sometimes you hear a certain woman that looks a certain way say, talk about toxic masculinity, a lot of men hit that mute button quick. They're like,
Mm.
and I was talking to a mutual friend, shout out to Ash, and she was just talking about, like, we were agreeing about a certain message, but she was saying how, if you know sometimes she can't be the one to say it. Like, if I was in a certain masculine environment and I presented some of these ideas, like, they might be more open. All of a sudden, someone who might need to hear a certain message is more open to it. If I'm in the sauna with a bunch of men, and they're all talking about, a lot of sauna talk, and if they're more open to hearing the messenger matters, is what I'm trying to say. It's like, I wish the feminine wisdom could just be like injected by anybody, but like I said, when people hit the mute button because they're judging too quickly, they're not given a chance to communicate the things that need to be communicated. And honestly, it goes on the flip side. Like, there might be some things, men actually, some insight they could share with women who are quick to kind of discount or say it's coming from this person, I don't need to hear it.
Yeah, and I wish it wasn't that way. And it
Yeah,
shouldn't
me
be
too.
that way.
It
We
shouldn't
should
be.
be able to take wisdom from whoever holds that wisdom, and they shouldn't be discounted based on what they look like, think like, whatever. Like, Like if it's wisdom, you shouldn't be shutting yourself off to it. And if you are, it just shows that, how deeply embedded these things are into
Yeah.
our minds, that will immediately shut an idea down if it's being presented by someone that we don't think has authority on that, right? We're closed minded in that sense, if that's what's happening.
Yeah, some
Um
personalities lean towards openness, and being open is a spectrum, kind of like the dial I was talking about. If you turn openness up to 100, you'll join the first cult that comes to you, and you'll believe everything they tell you. But at the same time, if you put openness down to 0, then you're more likely to say no, or to close off, or to hit the mute button. Like, maybe you're listening, but it doesn't mean you actually care. It doesn't mean you're actually going to try to take what they're saying seriously. That's kind of what I mean by hitting the mute button. I see it sometimes because I get excited. I go on some tangents. And I can see it on people's faces. I've gotten good at that because they won't always tell me, "Hey, you're talking. I'm not really interested in this conversation." But I start to realize it sometimes when I'm in the middle of a rant. So that's why I like talking with you, especially because we allow each other the space to to express that excitement.
yeah. And one more thing too, that I don't want to forget, because I keep forgetting the things I want to say. But while I was doing research on this, it was talking about, how we've changed the way, I guess, we view women in general. Like, not even like, what is it, 50, 60 decades back, there was this more of an idea of, yeah, women can be these strong and have, intuition, and this wisdom. And and nowadays, they were saying that it's more like what is valued is just their beauty, and they've been reduced to just, do I fit that role of being caring and nurturing and beautiful? And and those things obviously are just hurting the women that have those qualities and aren't being seen for their value. And that, the same thing
Mm.
has happened for men. And I was listening to someone talk about this, and they were saying that, you know we didn't get everything wrong in the past, when, previous ideas of what it meant to be a man. And they were talking about the Greeks, and the root word for where the word virile comes from is the same one in the word virtue. And those virtues that men can hold, like, I feel like if we are able to start associating masculinity and femininity to these traits, and also realizing that we are able to hold both at the same time, and it doesn't make us any less of a man or any less of a woman, but it actually just makes us more human, then I think we'll be able to make a lot of progress, with our society.
Yeah, I would go as far to say that we're almost, not only are we able to, I think we're meant to hold a little bit of both sides of that. I think achieving that balance, and like we said, femininity, masculinity, social constructs. So, depending on where you are in the world, what time period you are, like, there's so many places we can go. But I wanted to talk a little bit about rites of passage, because bringing up the global perspective, I think there's just some unique insight into the psychology and some of the opportunity that rituals and cultural elements can present in certain communities. So I'm going to start by explaining something called Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance, and it's just a fancy term to talk about initiations, rituals, and the severe rituals especially can create cognitive dissonance. The dissonance being group attraction. Um, proving that there's a correlation between like the severity and the suffering associated with initiation. Um, the more suffering that's involved, the more affiliation, or the more they like a group that they're being inducted into, or they're willing to overlook the negatives or overemphasize the positives that they identify with, like why the group is good. And that's kind of a psychological trick, and that can be used good or bad. And I just want to talk about a unique one in the South Pacific. I know you want to talk about that, but and it's a small nation of Vanuatu is what it's called. It's a small nation and island. There's an island off the nation of Vanuatu where they do something called land jumping, which is the first people to ever do bungee jumping. And that's
Wow.
interesting. Very, yeah, because they use vines from the banyan tree, but they climb up a scaffolding tower, and the men do, and they jump off, and the goal is to brush their shoulders and head against the ground. It's supposed to mean there's a good harvest, but it's a symbol of masculinity for them, because it's there's boldness, there's bravery, there's risk taking, there's some pride in that, and like the women stand on the side and kind of cheer them on. It's interesting, but I'm bringing it up because young boys do a lower level of that, and like when they do their first land dive, it's a symbol of them kind of transitioning from boy to man, and they have those expectations in their culture of what it means to be a man. But the boy jumping after the jump, it's very aware that now he's somebody different. He's there's more expectation, there's more responsibility. We're moving forward. We're transitioning. Our life is transitioning from the time when I was a baby to and when I needed everything done for me to I'm going to start taking on responsibility. I'm going to start, and that event, that ritual is a very clear and concise time, kind of like a bar mitzvah or other coming of age things, where it's not, that's the opportunity. That's what I mean is, okay, it's the opportunity for them to empower kind of the jump start they might need to transition. And because that's not always easy.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in those rituals, and especially because for anyone that doesn't go through one, then it could be easier for you to kind of get stuck in that kind of boyish mentality and never really wanting to grow up or accept higher responsibility for yourself and for others. And I've heard that it's something that's happening now. Um, like, you know, I hear just like people talking about like, oh, there's a lot of boys living in their parents' garage and just playing video games, and not really trying to go out there. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Not just these expectations, but socioeconomic factors and all that jazz. But regardless, it's the this transition between realizing that you're not a boy anymore, right? You are now become part of the group of, okay, you have some responsibility. I think is the most important word that you said there.
Yeah.
It means you're able to respond, right? You have this responsibility for yourself and for others, and it doesn't have to be in that negative way of, oh, I'm independent now and I can't seek help, right? But it just means
Yeah.
that you're going to take up charge and be responsible at the very least for yourself, and hopefully also the people around you.
Yeah, and ideally, like we always talk about belief. So if you jump off, if you land dive just like all the other men, and they're all cheering you on and they're helping you out, or in some situations, it's a different kind of, I think it's a different place in Africa where they're supposed to stick their arm into like a giant anthill. They're like those African fire
Hmm.
ants, and like the pain and suffering is so much. But then there's that's the jump someone could use to then start a belief. Okay, well, I now believe that I'm ready for this. They believe I'm ready for this. So, and I did the thing that hurt, that was challenging, that everyone is willing to tell me that I'm ready for. So then let me believe that I'm ready for it. Because
Hmm.
some people it's hard for them to believe. Like, yeah, like who am I? Maybe I'm not the smartest. Maybe I'm not the strongest. Maybe I can't. I don't want to compete in the workforce. All this stuff. But if the belief goes a long way, if you want to become the best version of yourself, uh, good luck challenging that idea.
Yeah. Wow. And you just brought up something that I learned about when I was getting my coaching certification, and that like all self sabotaging comes from your identity. So I think that's another part of the power of these rituals, that you're shifting your identity. You go through
Yeah.
that phase of, okay, now it's different. Now I did the thing, and that means something. And because you did it, it gives you that confidence that you shouldn't shy away from those responsibilities, or that you're not able to handle them.
Yeah, I love that you talked about identity. Yeah, because I'm always talking about belief, but someone's identity, a lot of people have a strong sense of identity and what goes with it, what goes against it. And, you know, I actually, I want to give a tangent because there's another aspect of masculinity I want to talk about, which is kind of like invading spaces, being competitive. But I want to start this transition by saying the land diving I was talking about, the bungee jumping, apparently, I read from a source in National Geographic that there's a legend of a woman who was actually running because she was being sexually mistreated by her husband. She ran away. She was running away from her husband, climbed a banyan tree, tied the vines to her ankles, and he chased her up the banyan tree, and she jumped off, effectively bungee jumping, and he jumped
Mm-hmm.
off after her and died because and she lived because she tied those vines to herself, and it's a specific time of year too, because if you jump at the wrong time of year, it actually happened. They forced someone to do it while the queen was there or something, and it wasn't the right time of season, and the things
Uh-oh.
broke and the guy died. But like the legend starts from a woman running away from a man, right? And then all of a sudden it becomes a ritual embedded in their culture where men are doing it only, and the men are specific, or
Wow.
the women are specifically, and it's like, wait, this whole thing started because a woman was just like, did we miss the message? I don't know, but it became culturally significant. I just think it's funny because there was a different comment I read on social media where there's a woman talking about ping pong, actually, in gym class, and how they had three tables set up, and there was kind of one of the tables was kind of not good, and it was kind of became the girls' table, and she was saying that the boys were so eager and trying to compete and win in gym class, and there was a limited amount of time, that they would swarm the girls' table and kind of force them out of the space, like just made them uncomfortable. There was just that
Mm.
hyper competitive nature. It's a game. You're supposed to have fun, or the idea is like, okay, let's get coordinated, let's move our body. But she was just like, no wonder I was driven away from sports. Like they just and men just invade all the spaces, and it's like I'm reading that like, she's kind of right. Like I was so eager I was, it's like there's a limited amount of time. I'm trying to play ping pong. Like I, my intentions were never to draw or anyone away, but competitive vibes make certain people feel uncomfortable. Just competition, and I don't know. But everyone deserves a chance to move their body and play a game. Games are called games because you're meant to have fun, you're meant to enjoy them.
Right. Yeah, I come from the that other side of I love ping pong, but I'm not there to compete or to show off. And I can say that I have felt that discomfort of like, you know what? These guys are here to just show everyone that they're the best ever, and I wasn't having that much fun playing against them because they weren't giving me a chance to even warm up. They were like, "All right, you ready to get destroyed?" And it's like, honestly, no. I just got here." But
Yeah,
then it
yeah.
was like, all right, you know what? Let's just finish this off. I'm gonna wait till someone wants to play and have fun, and at least allow me to get into the zone before it's like, all right, are you ready? Because honestly, for the sake of competition, this reminds me of Goku. Like Goku always wants his opponent to be at their very best, right? And
Yeah,
you would want
yeah.
that. If you really want to
You would
compete
want that.
against someone, you would want them to be at their best. Otherwise, it's just an ego trip. You just want to feel good about
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, and having fun I remember there's a certain mindset some people might identify with where it's like, if we're not keeping score, what's the point? When I was younger, especially, it was like I felt that way. I don't know, I was excellence as a value. I It was one of my top values. It's not as much anymore. Once, when I'm reflecting as I get older, I'm thinking of what you're saying, and maybe because I'm not as excellent as I used to be, right? But
Mm,
realizing it's not all it's cracked up to be. The best of the best, sometimes the relationships suffer. They have to make a lot of sacrifices to be the best of the best. Um,
right.
Thinking about, I have no shame in saying it, the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders show. I love that show from just a human perspective. It's a lot of the elite dancers, a lot of women who, dancing doesn't normally lead to a good career. Like a lot of these women have side jobs. They love to dance. They want to be a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader. And although it's a business, it's very hyper competitive, even though a lot of these women aren't in touch with the competition side of it. They're more like all together, like wishing each other well, like telling each other, oh my god, you did so great, and like, oh, I hate that that I'm competing with these other women for the spot, but they understand cuts have to be made. It just opposes, uh, in my opinion, the masculine vibe of like, Hard Knocks in the NFL, where the football players know it's, kill or be killed. Like, I get the job or somebody else gets the job. I gotta, that's just how it works. And they just accept like it's dog eat dog. And so those mentalities are very different. And I think, yeah, there's a sacrifice to make to be the best of the best. It's not all it's cracked up to be. Not that I
Right.
all would know.
Yeah, but you're right. And I think that speaks to what we were saying about the need for that balance, right? Because uh, from with the ping pong example, like I was always so focused on having fun that I hated trying to keep score, and I was like, it's distracting me from
Yeah, it
having
does
fun.
distract me.
But at the same time, it's like, well, hey, like when someone was like, well, let's actually play a game, and it's like, let's see, and let's have like, a good match. I would still wouldn't want to keep track of the score, and it was like, hey, like, don't you want to like participate in this? And I was like, you know what? Yeah, you're right. I should at least try to keep score when it comes to these things, and I got better at it, and and I didn't shy away from like, okay, this is more competitive. I shouldn't be like, oh, this isn't gonna be fun anymore because now there's all this pressure. But
Yeah.
I learned to make it fun and find some balance between like having fun, but also taking it seriously and being like, all right, this is a competition, and in the end, someone's gonna win, someone's gonna lose. It's not gonna matter as long as we have a good time and we try our best.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually, we were playing at the Halloween party. Remember, we were playing ping pong at the Halloween party. It was nice.
Yeah.
And there's a friend of ours, Landon, very good at ping pong. I think me and you were the best ones there, but Landon actually, he beat me that night, and he was very good. He was a tennis player. He a
Oh
lot of
yeah.
power behind his shots. Yeah, yeah, and admired that. It was fun. It was intense playing him. You know, not that I don't like the intensity. I like being the best I can be, but um, I actually played a game with my future brother-in-law, Bryce. Shout out to Bryce. After, and we were just kind of rallying. We were kind of just lobbing the ball. The pace wasn't fast. We were even kind of talking while we were playing, like, and it was just fun. It was actually one of the more fun games we had because we each had a lot of time to get to the ball, and we both hit some good shots. And the rally was long. We were both laughing and smiling by the end of it, and it was just
Mm-hmm.
such a different energy. And he was the one that actually said the words that I already recited, which was, "It's a game. We're supposed to have fun." And like, he really helped me readjust all of a sudden because I lost to Landon. I was kind of upset. I'm a competitive guy, so it's like, I know I could have beat him, and he got me too many times with this move or that move. I'm thinking too much about it, and then Bryce came along, and we just had a simple, fun game, and I told him I love you, man. Like, and because having people like him around helps me find the balance. If there's a bunch of Bretts around me after I lost to that guy, it's not going to look so good. But
Yeah.
having him around really, I really appreciated him in that moment and his nature. And um, I think everyone could use a Bryce, or a lot of people who are very neurotic, a lot of thoughts, break the cycle, help get a different perspective, and maybe shift your own if it needs to be shifted.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd encourage anyone to, express themselves and express their values in the most honest and compassionate way possible, but to do so.
Yeah, as always, it's easier said than done. We talk about it. We're not masters of these things, and there's gaps in our knowledge. And I hope we can start a discussion if anyone's willing to have a chat with us in the comments. Maybe I'll set a poll in the Spotify.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would love to continue the discussion and hear what other people think about this, cuz we don't know it all, and the more perspectives that we have and the more that we can understand each other, the better we're all going to be off, cuz at the end of the day, this whole talk wasn't about needing more or less masculinity or femininity, but the fact that we need more of a balanced humanity, right? of courage paired with compassion, of strength paired with vulnerability,
And
and
love.
of firmness, yeah, paired with tenderness and love.
So yeah, Soul said it better than I could have ever put it. So, and this is the kind of chat where I know there's a lot of people who had something to say somewhere along the line that we missed, and I bet we did miss a lot. So feel free to tell us. We're here to listen, and thank you very much for if you've listened this whole time. And please consider liking and subscribing, and we will see you next time.
Much love, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Peace.